Cronos, the New Dawn dangles a really alluring carrot in front of anyone familiar with survival horror, promising almost to take heed of Alan Wake 2's critical acclaim and craft a video game that kind of breaks the mold we've all grown so tired of, that tells a story worth hearing. One that gives us a world worth diving into and spending the day you could spend having a job, theorizing on its many intricacies and implications. However, when you promise to deliver a new breed of survival horror, the carrot in question, you've gotta let me eat the damn carrot. So having said all of that in the intro, I know we're all here to figure out if this is a game worth playing first and foremost. So despite all that came before, I'm really happy to report that yes, overall this is a good and competent survival horror experience. In fact, it's kind of as if Bloober Team took every survival horror game since Sweet Home in 1989, chucked them in a big old pot and stirred until something original emerged. The inventory system is fine. It's a little simple. I miss the Tetris-like minigame that Resident Evil has. What we've got here is functional and definitely crucial to upgrade if you're a hoarder like I am. Touching on the upgrade system briefly, it follows the trend of being simple but functional. There's not much to complain about, nor anything to write home about. Now the gunplay here is very solid. There's not a ton of variety to choose from, but what you have is punchy and impactful, something these developers always manage to deliver on. So in truth, this game doesn't really do anything all that unique with its gameplay, but the caveat here is that it does do almost everything really well. You have very few gadgets, but they do coalesce well into a simple but again very functional tool belt that makes damn sure everything has its use. So no tool or weapon really lags behind in that regard. You do have melee options, limited to stomping and a few unwieldy looking punches, but they're rather clunky, and while it is worth throwing a few hands to conserve some of that ammo you desperately need, it's far more enjoyable just to kind of pump everything full of lead. So there are no dodge mechanics, but it makes sense if you think about how heavy these suits look. And not every game needs to have dodges, I know. However, I don't think it's unreasonable for me to say that at the very least, even with the whole big brutalist spacesuit thing you've got going on, you should be able to do something more than just stand there like your controller disconnected. I am sure these suits aren't so heavy that you can't let me bring my hands up to block like a flat percentage of damage or something. You don't have to give me a parry. I don't need a get out of jail free card every time I make a mistake, but it feels a little silly as is. I would have liked to see something to diversify the gameplay loop a little. So as it stands, your response to every enemy type usually boils down to shooting them multiple times, or stunning them with fire and then shooting them multiple times. There are no finishers to give combat, visual variety. There are very little environmental interactions you can leverage besides the occasional explosive barrel and a few hazards that set enemies on fire, so you guessed it, you can shoot them multiple times. And the weapons, while punchy and impactful like I mentioned, don't entirely differentiate themselves enough to solve this issue. So there is this mechanic that, in short, requires you to manipulate the state of something called an oddity, or a temporal anomaly, to change the environment around you, to unlock new pathways or create bridges. And as it stands, it's a really interesting tool for exploration and shortcuts and all that. But I would have liked the ability to use it more in combat. You only really use it to rebuild a few of the explosive barrels, but you're never really able to manipulate these oddities in ways that trap or hit or drop the enemies to their deaths, and I think that's a bit of a missed opportunity. You do have gravity boots that allow you to walk on walls and ceilings and launch yourself from gravity pad to gravity pad. It looks great and makes exploring interesting, but besides one single section, the game doesn't really take advantage of the potential to diversify combat in that way. Look, my point is that they kind of have everything they need to make the moment-to-moment gameplay more interesting, and I hope and pray that in future projects they let their gadgets and gizmos express themselves with far greater liberty. Enemy variety is good. The game introduces enemies to you in a way that keeps the encounters feeling fresh without needlessly front-loading its diversity. There are your standard grunts, your bigger enemies, your bosses, your armored enemies, your ranged enemies, and there are even a few living environmental hazards you need to watch out for. It all makes for a pretty engaging experience trying to juggle between each enemy and their strengths and weaknesses. Visual variety is solid, but lacking slightly. I would make the caveat that it's understandable, as thematically they all have to be these terrifying body horror amalgamations of some very unlucky people. There's only so much you can do with that. But one thing that puzzled me a little was that in most encounters you'd only really be dealing with 1 or 2 enemy types. You're almost never forced to engage with 2 problems that have opposing solutions. For example, dealing with a fast, strong enemy that requires constant repositioning in an area littered with those explosive acid pustules that require you to move slowly and carefully. Look, everything can always be done better, so I'd like to stress that I was impressed by the enemy variety and really enjoyed the majority of encounters. Now, there are very few true bosses in the game, but the ones you do encounter are really fun to fight. Except for the final boss. Video games really need to get it together, man. Why do we always slack when we're designing the boss that'll shape your final impression of the game? Like, it doesn't quite ruin the experience, but it's just shit. Now, merging, the thing that we're told explicitly not to let them do. Don't let them merge was the big motto, the tagline of this game's marketing campaign, and that kind of may be all it ends up being. The enemies do merge. If you leave a corpse unburnt on the ground, enemies will try their best to merge with it, resulting in stronger enemies that are then harder to deal with and kind of absorb some of the properties of the corpse it merged with. So far, this is sounding all as promised, right? Well, kinda. Merging as a mechanic fades into obscurity almost immediately as you discover how trivial it is to prevent. You know, I burnt corpses maybe once or twice in 20 hours of gameplay. If an enemy tries to get intimate with a dead guy, just shoot it. It'll be fine. And even if they do manage to merge, it's okay, I promise. It's only really difficult when big, already strong guys get stronger. You know, the worst you'll really encounter is a grunt getting a little confident because he has some armor now. The enemies don't roam freely, nor do they really pop up when backtracking that much, so you don't have to be concerned about leaving corpses everywhere after an encounter. Now, the partial absence of a unique feature doesn't really hurt the game per se, but it does make it a little disappointing if you were particularly enticed by the whole merging thing. So this game has no difficulty settings. It is difficult in that it requires you to pay attention and be aware of your surroundings, your gear, your inventory space. It's not a game that you can play while half watching a YouTube video. It demands focus. That being said, I wouldn't say it's very difficult bar a few select areas that kind of just throw a heap of shit at you. The level design is a little misleading at first, actually. It is very linear up front, and while it remains linear throughout, the first area or so does no justice to the rest of the game, as it opens up fantastically. There is some really engaging level design showcased here. Nooks and crannies abound, shortcuts that loop back into Resident Evil inspired save rooms, mini hubs for each area, little puzzles here and there, and lots of sweet loot for goblins like me. Now, if you're expecting Raccoon City Police Station or something, you'll be disappointed, but if you meet the game where it's at, every major area is a true joy to explore. Committed exploration will reward you, mostly with resources and materials, but I am absolutely chuffed to report that there are a few juicy rewards for you down the line. It's also worth mentioning that this game does do that thing we always make fun of in games, where they make it clear that you can't go a certain way by putting a cardboard box or something in a doorway and calling it a day. I doubt that'll be a deal breaker for you, but it's fun to laugh at anyways. You should know that this game is paced very slowly. I mean, like, exceptionally slowly. For better or for worse, there is much downtime between encounters and major story beats, lots of note reading, visual storytelling, and a true commitment to let the atmosphere speak for itself. Now, I personally like this approach, but understandably, some of you won't. So be warned, if you expect non-stop heart-pounding action, this might not be the one for you. So it is a really tired trope in video game development to front load your content. Some of my favorite studios still do it. From Software, I am talking about you, and I am talking directly to Miyazaki here. While the first impression of a game is admittedly the most important, I think the last comes second place, and it's not even close. Cronos: The New Dawn, however, does not front load its content. In fact, it distributes it almost too well. many may bounce off the game's humble beginnings. Look, I think despite its flaws and unfortunate lack of innovation, this one boon helps it rise far above many other games that might otherwise be better received. Now, with all of that said and done, in my eyes, the big takeaway here is that this game is truly saved by its pacing. Now, the presentation is where this game outshines the competition by a country mile. With one big but I'll circle back around to that one. I promise you'll definitely hear about that at the end of this segment. I'll get a very small criticism out of the way initially. The UI is okay, fine. It's thematic enough to avoid clashing with the game's aesthetic, but it's really purely functional, sometimes a little ugly. Specifically, the prompt for a few interactions has this really big and ugly E that's a little absolutely horrid to look at. Luckily, I forgot about it after a few hours, but the initial shock certainly left an impression. Now, the art direction here is phenomenal. It is almost redundant to talk about objective technical fidelity here when it merely serves to uplift what is expressed entirely in the game's visual personality. It is an entirely cohesive and mysterious aesthetic that bombards you with a thick, heavy atmosphere. It is unending and it might be the game's biggest strength. Whoever was in charge of the art here has seamlessly blended retrofuturism with tasteful brutalism, and if you've ever seen this movie, it reminds me a little of how the future is presented in 12 Monkeys. I don't know, that might be a bit too deep of a cut, and much like this game, the future isn't really shown or explained all that much or at all, so maybe that doesn't hit for you like it does for me, but oh well. Gotta say that I am in love with the function over form visual approach to the collective's technology, and especially the peculiar but kind of weirdly enticing design of the suit, or the temporal shell as I think it's called. Now, I'll be honest, I'm not sure how designing a helmet that looks like it dispenses gumballs is functional, but I reckon I'll let Bloober Team explain that one. It looks great, so I don't mind, truly. So the enemies are all, no doubt, inspired by the necromorphs in Dead Space and its sequels, and even perhaps The Thing in 1982's The Thing. So by default, they look pretty horrifying, harrowing. I will say though, they've managed to give the orphans, as they're named, a bit of a beyond human comprehension spin. And now that I think about it, their design is super reminiscent of a really solid Lovecraftian-esque horror game called Still Wakes the Deep by the Chinese Room. That's a little non-sponsored offhand recommendation for you if you dig the style. These creature designs are complemented by an environment that lets the aforementioned horrors beyond human comprehension mingle with a really poignant representation of the Polish People's Republic, that is, communist Poland in the industrial 1980s. Now, the world is full of Soviet propaganda, which is a metaphorical parasite facing a worthy adversary in the change, as it's called, and its literal parasitic nature. This nurtures a flair that helps the game kind of crawl out from under the weight of its admittedly numberless similarities with survival horror's greatest hits. As I mentioned earlier, technical fidelity may be less relevant amidst great art direction, but it's still worth touching on briefly. It's great, it's nothing special nowadays, it's Unreal Engine 5. To reiterate, I have very little issue with how it looks. It serves its purpose near perfectly. The lighting is nice, it's soft and envelops the environment, it doesn't look gamey. The textures are standard, still very nice again. It's not worth expanding on. I'm here to persuade or perhaps dissuade you from spending your hard-earned money on something, so diving deep into a thing you won't notice is not really my job. Now, I said way back in the beginning that the weapons were punchy and impactful. Bloober Team have proven that they are masters of sound, and the rest of the game follows suit. The visual atmosphere is thick, but the sound, my god, it is a force to be reckoned with. From bumps and bangs to growls and screams, it is seriously a treat to experience from beginning to end. Funnily enough, oftentimes the dynamic range and directional audio was so good that it took me out of the game. Like I'd hear a super duper harrowing scream or a spine tickling creak, and I would marvel at how I always knew exactly where the sound was coming from, down to the pixel I mean. Now this soundtrack is going to have a very difficult time justifying its subtlety in a world where Expedition 33 exists. However, I believe that simplicity can be just as memorable, and here it's pretty damn good. Now, once upon a time, when I studied for all of 2 minutes, I would listen to Blade Runner's ambient blues tracks, and that vibe has always been a silent favorite of mine. And here they've essentially twisted Blade Runner's soundtrack and made it more harrowing than existential, and I am serious, I'm all for it. Okay, so I hate to end this segment on a negative note because it's been so positive compared to the gameplay section. I know you've already heard it all by now, and it's really easy for me to tell you how rough the performance is and how we all hate Unreal Engine 5 and that my indoor cat was tragically run over by a video game engine. But I think I can do it in a way that allows you to decide whether it performs well enough for you, and also allow me to tell you how cool and good my PC is without showing off, which is a good trade, I think. So I have a 4090 paired with a 7950 X3D, so by all means I should be able to run this game at 4K, max settings, ray tracing and all, at let's say a humble 60 frames per second. Here that nets me 25 FPS, give or take, or just take. So good luck.
Listen to the will of those who will not speak. And if the tools are not willing, they will be.
So we are here. This is the carrot. Cronos, the New Dawn, spirits you away into the grim industrial reality of 1980s communist Poland, ravaged by an apocalyptic event known simply as the Change. In present day, it is left barren, devoid of conscious life and left in the care of an inscrutable and all-consuming biomass. The world has been swallowed by this change and does little more than regurgitate indescribable horrors into its carcass. That sounds cool, but you know, so far I've played a million games set in apocalyptic worlds with all sorts of indescribable horrors, so what's the catch? Well, you play as the Traveler, awoken into this wasteland, humanoid but unfeeling and robotic. You are tasked with, or programmed to, scour a lifeless Poland in search of specific rifts in time that you can use to travel back to a time just shy of the ensuing apocalypse. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Once inside, you are given a target, a person that, along with everyone else, was killed or changed during the change. Once you find this target, you have to harvest their soul, store their essence inside your suit, and help them ascend, whatever that means. I mean, holy shit, this could be an all-timer story. This is awesome. This game drip feeds you the most intriguing narrative you've ever heard through well-written notes, well-acted recordings, and heaps of environmental storytelling. The gamey Resident Evil-esque safe rooms and the abundance of resources, ammunition, and weapons littered around the place that so many games fail to explain have a really clever in-universe explanation. In short, the Travelers do sort of a for those who come after type thing and lay the path, as they say. So it makes sense that they'd leave behind structures and the like to aid you in picking up where they left off. The few cutscenes you do get are voiced acceptably to amazingly. The game spends 18 hours teasing cosmic horror, Soviet mind control, and to top it all off, a profoundly human story about emotion, humanity, perfection and imperfection, all of this through the eyes of a blank slate, a tool, programmed to do a job, nothing more, nothing less. You know, who is the collective? What happens when you ascend? Who are the Travelers? What's inside the suit? What is the change? Is it evolution? Is it a cosmic parasite? So many questions. And I'll admit, I was prepared to have none of these questions answered. That's the nature of these stories. These things usually aren't for comprehension, they just are. But there are characters and concepts that encourage you to discover your humanity. The essences you keep imprint on you, merge with you, become you. I was told to think about who I kept, who I erased, and the personalities of those in my phylactery. There are cats everywhere in this game, past and future. They represent hope and foster further humanity in the protagonist. I was gearing up for an ending I was increasingly excited to witness. Look, I was under the impression that I was getting a story about human nature and its perfect chaos, being the hero up against the collective and its imperfect order. A story about rebellion, about perseverance, and all that jazz. And for 18 hours, that is what I got. But this game took 20 hours, and that is unfortunately not what I was left with. Now, I won't spoil anything here, but there are decisions and dialogue choices that kind of trick you into thinking you're preparing for a different conclusion than you are. There is an entirely different story hidden in the promises of this game's runtime that, in my humble opinion, is so much better than what we get. Now, I want to stress that this is not a bad story by any means. It makes sense. It isn't Game of Thrones season 8, you know? You won't find a million billion plot holes to never stop talking about years and years later. But you might just be disappointed. You know, things matter far less than they seem. The carrot here is the masterpiece that this game had all, and I mean all, the potential to be. Hey, if you're still with me, hi, I'm James, and this is the Waffle Iron. Now, I like to rate my games a little differently, like waffles hot off the iron from raw right on through to crispy golden perfection. And if the bite is right, maybe a dash of syrup. Now, Cronos, the New Dawn. If this review sounded overly negative, I apologize. I'd like to bring you back a little and reiterate that this game really does nail the fundamentals of survival horror. And for the majority of the game, I was all aboard and having a ton of fun. It's just in the lack of innovation and the promise of greater things where this game tends to stumble a little. But that being said, there is far too much talent and love injected into this thing for it to be anything less than fluffy.